We are continuing with Rising's new series of interviews with interesting social media figures. Next up is Dave Smith, a comedian and host of the Part of the Problem podcast. Smith identifies as a libertarian, like me. He's known for calling out Democrats, Republicans, and also plenty of other libertarians, particularly when they espouse interventionist foreign policy views that he thinks have led the country down a bad path for far too long. Smith joins us now to discuss Biden, Trump, everything else that's going on right now. Welcome to Rising, Dave.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for having me.
So there's been some news this week. I don't know if you've heard the former president, Donald Trump, was almost assassinated, murdered. Joe Biden's not having a very good week and is sort of widely expected now to actually exit the ticket any day. I bet against it, so I'm going to be the moron here if my prediction ends up wrong. Of course, now he has COVID, which could be like his excuse because so many liberals and progressives still think that is so debilitating that, how could you even go on? What do you make of what's happening? Let's start with Biden. What should Democrats be thinking? Because the bottom line is Kamala Harris, she polls maybe a little bit better than Biden. I accept that possibly she would be a stronger candidate, although she still looks likely to lose to Trump to me.
Yeah, well, I would say, number one, the major scandal here is that clearly President Biden wasn't vaccinated. So that's something we should be looking into.
Because he said you're not going to get it. He famously said that. You can't get it if you're vaccinated.
Well, okay, so I have been predicting for quite a while now that Biden wouldn't be the nominee from well before his catastrophic debate performance. But I wouldn't say, I was making the prediction not with 100% certainty. Much closer to 100% certainty now. It's just, look, politics, as much as people like me and you don't want to acknowledge this, voters who pay very little attention greatly outnumber voters who pay a lot of attention to politics. And overall, that's probably a good thing. There's too many of us. But just looking at the optics of this, which is what most people are going to look at, it's like completely unprecedented. There's nothing like the last 3-week stretch that I could even compare it to, where the optics are so bad for Biden and so good for Donald Trump. And obviously, he moved his head a fraction of an inch out of the way from being assassinated on national television. But it looked so cool. The fact that the guy, he gets up and gives the fist with blood all over his face, this and the juxtaposition to the current president who's having trouble walking and speaking, and then to have to cancel campaign events over COVID, it's just another thing that makes him look weak and old. The video that was coming out today of him coming down the stairs of Air Force One there, it's just... No reasonable person can argue that this guy is fit to be president. And so you're right, Kamala Harris is a problematic candidate in her own right, and the polls aren't much different, but she's at least not that. And so I think with the Democratic donor base, with the Democratic congressional base, and now what appears to be Barack Obama turning against Joe Biden, I just don't see any way that he can survive this.
Of course, he just has to stick it out, right? He can have everyone on the earth, and as long as the delegates still back him, and so far the reporting I've seen suggests the delegates are still going to vote for him unless he specifically tells them that they don't have to. So we have to count on, yes, would I think it would be persuasive that Barack Obama and all senior members of the party and everyone in the media is telling him to get out? Yes. But if at the end of the day, the only people he's listening to are Jill Biden and Hunter Biden, and all he has to do is do nothing and he gets it by default, that's what maybe I don't expect that to happen anymore. I still think that, because he clearly wants to be president. Both these men want to be president very, very badly. It's kind of like awe-inspiring is not the right word, almost terrifying how badly they hunger for more political power. Joe Biden, elderly, should be enjoying retirement, not up for this remotely whatsoever anymore, still seeking it. Donald Trump lost last time, has faced multiple criminal indictments, has had his entire party turn on him multiple times and said, no, I demand to be president again, I will be president again, and now has completely won, has won to an unprecedented degree, even for him, that struggle over his own party. I don't know how much of the RNC you've been watching this week. He there is zero dissent. There is less dissent against Trump within the party than ever before. It is his party. He has won it totally and utterly out of just his conviction that he should be president again.
Well, look, I mean, the obvious asymmetry there is that Donald Trump has tens of millions of hardcore, followers who want him and only him to be the nominee. That's just not the case with Joe Biden. And the truth is, I saw some people on, oh God, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was somebody, I think on MSNBC, who was trying to spin it as if like, well, look, I mean, the Democrats are so much better. Oh, I think it was Brian Stelter, actually. I think it was on CNN, my mistake, that he was saying, well, look, I mean, the Democrats have these conversations about switching their nominee, but the Republicans will never have this conversation. But that's totally not true. I mean, look, however you feel about the guy, the objective fact is that in 2016, when Donald Trump was running for president, the entire Republican establishment was working against him. You had National Review ran their Never Trump edition. They pulled out Mitt Romney, the previous nominee, to give a speech saying anybody except this guy has to be the nominee. And of course, this year, a lot of the big donor Republican money was going toward, at different points, DeSantis and Nikki Haley. They were just rejected by the voters. The voters want Donald Trump. And of course, he was largely fueled by the raid in Mar-a-Lago and all of the other, court cases. And now, after this, surviving an assassination attempt, it's over. You can't get that guy out of the way. Joe Biden is a very different situation. This guy has been carried his entire presidency by the corporate media, who have just in the last few weeks bailed on him. Now, you're right, technically, he'd have to agree to step down, but I think there's all types of pressure that we know about and all types of pressure that we don't know about that can be put on a president. So my guess is that Joe Biden is going to make the decision within the next few days.
Yeah, they keep saying it's his decision to make, and when they're interviewed on the media, and the media will say, yeah, he made it. It's made. He says it's made. And then they'll say, whatever he does, we're with him, and he can just make that decision, but he better get to it. Again, it's already been made. Yeah, we're really waiting on that decision. It's starting to feel like, okay, we get what you're saying. All right, we're going to be back with more of this conversation. That's going to air in the weekend. Check that out. More Rising right after this. Back with comedian Dave Smith talking about the state of the race, going over the just constant stream of bad news for Joe Biden at a time where Donald Trump has never looked more likely to regain the White House. Let's talk about the attempted assassination for just a minute, because I know the questions that everyone has. It's not just like the ostensibly crazy people or whatever online. Like, no one is satisfied with the explanation of what happened here, because at its most basic, it was just a total and abject failure of the Secret Service, of the police on the ground, with bystanders pointing out this dangerous individual. Why was Trump not, at the very least, I understand if they're not going to whisk him off stage, I guess, every time there's a suspicious person, although this seemed like a far more already documented threat, but they didn't pull him down until after shots fired, one nicking him, killing someone in the crowd, and then we're led to believe that, well, it's a sloped roof, so we couldn't be up there. That was from the Secret Service's director. It's just utterly does not make any sense. I'm going to be interested to hear from her when she's hauled before Congress on Monday.
Yeah, you were one of the first people I saw who tweeted out that excuse just made no sense. And I actually read your tweet on my latest podcast, because you're absolutely right. And then it was Glenn Greenwald who made the point, which I didn't even think of, but man, it was a really excellent point. Because look, even after this would-be assassin was killed, it's not as if his body fell off the roof. So this just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Look, I mean, I was just arguing on Twitter the other day with somebody. Like, I'm not one of these guys who jumps on wild conspiracy theories. I hate that stuff. I think there are real conspiracies, and usually we have solid evidence for those. Like, I was arguing with someone who was like, we know this is Mossad who set this up, and it was a fake assassination. And you're like, wait, listen, there's just no evidence for that. But I would say, first of all, it's almost impossible for any human being, because we are by nature pattern recognizing creatures, it's very hard to not see the forces that have been going after Donald Trump since before he was president. I mean, you know, very powerful people have been framing him for being involved in a conspiracy with Russia. He's been impeached multiple times. He's been charged with all types of ridiculous charges that nobody else would have had brought against them. And so when you see something like this, it's hard to not, in your pattern-seeking brain, go, is this part of this whole pattern? What we know is that this is somewhere on a spectrum. And at the best end of the spectrum, it is such wild incompetence that we should have already seen mass resignations. And on the other end of the spectrum is some type of conspiracy. I don't know, and I'll be very interested to find out more and more of this. We're still just getting little bits of information out slowly, but it does seem that, you know, just on the face of it, to have this direct line of sight only less than 200 yards away from the former president, current frontrunner, to have multiple warnings about it and to not have this area secured it's hard to imagine.
Yeah, the conspiracy I totally reject. Is I've heard some people on the other, you know, on the Democratic side saying, oh, this was the Trump people wanted this because it got this great photo op. You know, they were instructed just to graze him. I'm like, you can't. There's no one is arranging for someone to take a shot at them at that distance and just graze them. Like, that's impossible. I mean, I wouldn't have believed this happened, except that it clearly did happen. We have video of it. To just, like, when it happens on TV, it's ridiculous. To be nicked by a bullet, that's an inch away from either it just doesn't hit you or death. Like, people don't understand that, you know, even very precise people with guns can't offer you any certainty that you would just be minorly injured or grazed by a bullet.
Yes, no, that of all the conspiracies, that is the most ridiculous one. The idea, like, I mean, there's some people who are saying he didn't really get shot. If you want to go down that path, okay. But if you're saying that Donald Trump planned out with a guy, now look, I turn like this, and then you shoot me. Make sure you wait for me to turn like this, or you will splatter my brains all over. Like, yeah, no, that did not happen. So. That being said, by the way, I also reject that ridiculous conspiracy that he wasn't shot. It seems pretty clear that Donald Trump was shot in the ear. By the grace of God, he turned in that very moment, and that's what saved his life. It's wild to think about what an alternative reality we could be living in right now, which would be, whether you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, would be very, very bad if he had been assassinated.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, you know, what we've heard policy-wise coming out of the RNC. So J.D. Vance has joined the ticket. So you and I are both libertarians. I think we agree on most things, like most policies and ideas. We sometimes disagree on, like, what is the best political tactic or whatever. You know, we've argued about what the Libertarian Party should do and that kind of stuff. I will be honest that J.D. Vance was like my last choice of all the conceivable people in the mix for the vice presidency. I guess I don't. Maybe his foreign policy might be the appealing aspect of him to me. I'm really not happy about his economic policies. He's argued that Lena Khan is doing good work in the Biden administration, and I'm worried that whereas Trump is, you know, kind of this avatar of whatever you can, you know, put onto him in some ways whatever you want to see in terms of which direction you want the Republican Party to take, because he's not particularly ideological himself. Every now and then he has an ideological impulse, but he's capable of changing his mind and mostly brings the Republican Party over to whatever he thinks. But if his successor is going to be someone of much, I think, more strongly held ideological positions that, at least on economics, are not the direction I want to go, or I don't think are in a libertarian direction, was mildly unhappy about that.
Well, you know, I wouldn't say J.D. Vance was, for me, the last option that I would want. And I think that picking a vice president, in many ways, it was a signal about what Trump's thinking. I think that one of, if not the biggest weakness from Trump's first administration was just that his appointments were terrible and so ridiculous with his stated views. Or, like, I mean, he picked Mad Dog Mattis, who resigned when he said he wanted to pull out of Syria, or when he said he was going to go through with it, never did. But he had run on that. Like, how do you appoint guys who are not going to be willing to implement the policies you're running on? And of course, there are just a ton of other terrible appointments, Bolton and Pompeo, and even keeping Fauci on the job through all of 2020. I think all of this is horrible. And I think if he had selected Marco Rubio, that would have signaled something much worse. As far as J.D. Vance goes, I mean, the fact that he came into the convention on his first interview there, not his speech last night, but on the first night he was picked, he came in and his first interview started bragging about how tough Donald Trump was on Iran, and Joe Biden's so weak on Iran, and that's why October 7th happened, and we got to get tough on them. And I mean, to me, as soon as somebody starts like advocating for another war, I can't even imagine that after the last 25 years of American foreign policy and the two current proxy wars that we've gotten ourselves committed to now, that somebody is like bragging about finding the next one. By the way, a war that would be much more difficult than any of the wars we've fought over the last 20 plus years. So I was very disappointed with that. As far as the economics, yeah, you make a good point, but there's only like one Rand Paul and one Thomas Massey in Congress. So I don't know who was going to be better on that.
Yeah, very unfortunately. What do you, I've seen you talking on various, other shows. I saw you on Breaking Points talking about, what's happening in Israel and how, there are people on the right who want a different foreign policy. I think it's been very, and I've, had that debate on this show multiple times, what should be done, and I'm certainly for, probably like you, in not having the U.S. continue to contribute to other countries' defenses, or push them to do whatever policies or make them feel free to continue wars that are not popular here with our tax dollars. Do you think Donald Trump, a Trump administration, is going to chart an actually different course on Israel or on Ukraine? So many of the Republican voters and the base, so many of the Democratic voters and base too, not the people their leaders speak to, but the actual, rank and file do not want America first and don't want U.S. tax dollars spent overseas, and are very skeptical that what we're engaged with in both the Middle East and in Europe is making Americans safer. And again, Donald Trump is kind of you can project whatever you think onto him, because he doesn't end up saying a lot. He said almost nothing about Israel. I think he's allowed people to think he would be less hawkish on that, and also more hawkish, just depending on what you think about it. Do you think we're likely to see a different foreign policy in the next administration if it is Trump?
No. Unfortunately, no. I mean, look, what you have to go on is, yeah, well, I mean, look, he's got a 4-year track record, and then you can look at his rhetoric in this campaign. In terms of the track record, I would say I think Donald Trump bears a lot of responsibility for the war in Ukraine and for the military assault on Gaza right now. I mean, Donald Trump sent weapons into Ukraine. This is the the 2022 invasion, obviously. Donald Trump sent weapons into Ukraine that Obama was unwilling to send because he was concerned it would be a provocation of Vladimir Putin. It clearly was. I mean, imagine if there was like a civil war going on in Mexico with us backing one side, and then Russia or China started sending weapons into the other side. Like, what do you think D.C. would do? Mike, they would just back down? No, they were going to step it up. So he has responsibility for that. And in terms of, Donald Trump and really Jared Kushner got all behind the Netanyahu doctrine in a way that no U.S. president had previously. And they really, the Netanyahu doctrine was essentially the opposite of the Yitzhak Rabin doctrine. The old doctrine was, we have to make peace with the Palestinians, otherwise the surrounding Arab countries will never recognize us. And they tried to flip that and say, no, what we're going to do is bribe off all the surrounding Arab countries so that we never have to make peace with the Palestinians. So we can thwart the creation of a Palestinian state by doing this Abraham Accords type stuff. And I really think if you look at it, there's really no question that this completely backfired. The idea that you could signal to the Palestinians that your cause is completely hopeless and you have lost forever, that didn't work out well. Now, judging Trump off of his rhetoric, his rhetoric around Ukraine has at times, I think, been very good. So perhaps there's some reason to be optimistic there. However, I mean, even at the debate, which totally overshadowed by the fact that Joe Biden couldn't put sentences together, was to turn and call Joe Biden a lifelong committed Zionist who's currently funding Israel's war, to call him a Palestinian and say he's going to be even harder on the Gazans or something like that. This was a guy who bent over backward to do everything he could to please the Likud party in his first term. And I see no reason to expect anything different.
And then some of the, non-interventionist voices on the right, it's about turning to some new enemy. It's like we have to ignore, we should get out of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, not be involved in that because the Israel thing is more serious. Or sometimes both of those things are distractions from the true enemy, Iran, or those are all distractions from the true enemy, China. And I absolutely do see China as like a global rival that is up to no good in many ways. I don't want World War III with China. That would obviously be a disaster. We should try to, we should consider what peaceful policies can prepare us to confront the new reality of China without fully going to war with them, which is what some people many people in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party at the highest levels seem to want.
Yeah, and there's this this kind of ideology that just poisons Washington, D.C. And of course, as I'm sure you thought about in the past in different ways, there are certain kind of ideological views that get a lot of traction in Washington, D.C., and oftentimes for a reason. There's a reason why guys like Rawls and Keynes are beloved by the political class. And it's not because anyone sat there and thought that Keynes really won the intellectual argument against Hayek or something like that. It's just that you're preaching a theory that allows for more power in Washington, D.C. And it's a similar reason why the neocons had such amazing, success in terms of getting their policies implemented. It's well, you're going with the wind. I mean, if we follow your policies, there's going to be massive profits for the military-industrial complex. If we follow Ron Paul's policies, there's going to be next to zero. So, who's going to be more popular in D.C.? And likewise, there is this kind of ideological view that it's what the Republicans always say, right? They say peace through strength. And what they really mean by that is that we have to go around provoking everybody so that everybody knows you better not mess with America. And if we weren't to do that, then everyone would think we were weak and they would, get ready to attack us. The problem is aside from the, let's say the errors in theory, just empirically, this just leads to forever wars. I mean, when you're always constantly trying to provoke everybody, it's like going to a bar and being like, I got to start a fight with everybody so everyone's too scared to get in a fight with me. And then you go to a bar and every single night you're getting in a fight. And it's yeah, because that actually doesn't work. That's not a smart way to approach going out for the night. And likewise, as you get this idea that we always have to be thinking about who the next enemy is, and we constantly have to be demonstrating strength. Look, as you know, Robby, China is a rival. They're an economic competitor to us. But we already know what the answer is to win an economic competition. If we really wanted to outdo China, have drastic cuts in spending and regulation at home, drastic cuts in taxes. We know that's going to beat this quasi-commie, quasi-fascist nonsense anyway. We got the entire 20th century to prove that.
Yeah. So you have gotten big in independent media. You've been on Joe Rogan a number of times. I wanted to share with you two stories I just saw from the traditional media, the mainstream media, that crossed my feed as we were sitting here talking. Alex Wagner on MSNBC said that of J.D. Vance, when he spoke about wanting to be buried in his family plot in Kentucky, that was an Easter egg of white nationalism. And Rachel Maddow said that the affinity for Lord of the Rings that Vance-esque people like Peter Thiel have is, that's another harbinger of the alt-right. Is there what has gone wrong with the media? They're have such a good, they've really got their fingers on the pulse of where Americans are. They're running against the Lord. They want Democrats. No wonder Joe Biden isn't listening to the media. They want him to run against the Lord of the Rings and family burial customs.
Yeah, well, it's a very bizarre world that we live in. And there's, I think, particularly for people who are kind of in the elite media corporate media world, it's just very hard for them to adjust to the facts on the ground. And I think what's happened is that, look, if you just look at, like, say, the 21st century in America, I mean, what's been handed to the American people was like 9/11, two disastrous 20-year catastrophic wars that left both countries worse off than they were when we found them. And we had nothing but trillions of dollars wasted and tens of thousands of soldiers being killed or committing suicide in the wake of those wars. We had the biggest financial recession in 100 years in 2008. And then we had kind of the Obama phony recovery and the rise of insane wokeism really going into his second term. And all of this kind of resulted in Donald Trump. And the corporate media the whole time, they never wanted to look in the mirror and be like, oh, you know, we did a really bad job reporting on all of these. Like, as the elites were mismanaging everything, we really didn't serve our function and hold their feet to the fire. And instead, it was always just like every day a new ridiculous scandal that had nothing to do with what the American people actually cared about. And their only answer has been to turn it up to 11 with Donald Trump, that he represents some Hitlerian rise to power, which, however you feel about Donald Trump, is just totally removed from reality. We already lived under 4 years of him. That's not the problem. If anything, you ask me, the problem is he's too much more of the same. But look, all this stuff, the alt-right is like, they had a rally in 2017 with like 200 people. The next year they came back and there were 12 of them. The idea that somebody having some roots and caring about being buried in the same place where their family was buried, or caring about their hometown, or caring about the people they grew up in, the idea that that represents the alt-right, that represents humanity. And it's only like progressive elites who have such contempt for these things that are actually consistent throughout almost every culture in human history. It's just ridiculous to say that that makes you some type of like Klansman or Nazi or something like that.
Yes, indeed. Dave Smith, thank you so much for joining me today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Robby. Anytime.